Even though I'm a big coward when it comes to anything scary, this has to be the perfect place to share a terrifying incident that involved my cousins and myself about 15 years ago. At the time this happened, I was approaching my 16th birthday. My family had a big reunion every year in Southern California. Since I hadn't attended since I was little, my parents thought it would be a fun way to spend my summer break. It would also be a great opportunity to get to know my cousins. There was 3 of them, and they were all girls around my age. After I thought about it, it sounded fun, so I agreed and flew out the next month to Los Angeles. The reunion was held at the same hotel we were all staying in. When I arrived there, I was met by my cousins, Jennifer, Belinda, and Stormy. It was amazing how much alike we all looked. We all had long blonde hair and blue eyes, not to mention our facial similarities, but it made sense since our dads were brothers. The biggest difference was how tan they were. Since I had been inside all winter in Minnesota, they were much darker than me. My uncle and dad decided to let us stay in one room together. It was a big fancy bridal suite. When we saw the room, we came up with this joke that we were sisters and we were staying in the hotel together for my bachelorette party. I was chosen as the bachelorette because I was the oldest and looked a little different, like an older sister often does. We spent the rest of the day at the pool and talking to guys. Stormy, who was only 14, managed to trick a 25-year-old guy into thinking she was 19 and gave her his number. We were having so much fun, we stayed up until about 4 talking and laughing. In the morning, which was about noon for most of us, we ordered breakfast and then headed for the pool again. Our day turned out to be even more fun than the one before it. This time Stormy got a pair of twins to buy her lunch. That girl was on fire that week. Later that evening, we all got dolled up and had dinner at the hotel's restaurant. But this time, the story we'd created had taken on a life of its own. My cousins had been telling guys all day that we were there to party and asking them to buy them drinks. But most of the men were wise enough to know that they were lying. After dinner, we joined this cute pair of older guys that were sitting in the lobby. When they noticed us leaving the restaurant, they had asked us to sit with them, and since we had nothing else to do, we did. Once we had sat down, they began asking us our ages and names. Of course, we lied and said we were in our early 20s, and they actually believed us. I couldn't help but giggle a bit. This was the most fun I'd had in years. Jennifer and I didn't say much. We left that to Belinda and Stormy. At one point, Stormy invited them up to our room, but I had to take her aside and remind her that her dad was staying in the room next to ours and would surely not like it. I didn't want to be a stick in the mud, but I wasn't comfortable with having 2 strange men who looked to be like 30 or something in our room. At the point it was approaching midnight, I told the 2 younger girls it was time to go back to our room, and they argued at first. But once Jennifer backed me up, they gave in. We told the guys to meet us at the pool around 11 a.m. and we get lunch together. Then we went back upstairs to our room. We stayed up talking about the 2 men and what we were planning on doing when we saw them. That lasted until about 2 a.m. when we decided to go to bed. The lights had just been turned off in the room when we all heard the doorknob start jiggling very fast, like somebody was trying to get in. At first, I thought it was my mind tricking me, but once it started again, I got scared. I asked the other girls if they were also hearing it, and they said yes. Without thinking, Belinda jumped up from her bed and said she would see who it was. I yelled out to her to stop her from opening the door, but it was too late. Jennifer got up and turned on the lights, and I joined her at the end of the hall. When Belinda opened the door, she turned to us and said no one was there, then turned back to the door and stepped out into the hall. That was when we saw a person in a black mask jump out and grab her. As soon as they grabbed her, she began screaming and fighting to get away. By this time, Stormy had joined Jennifer and I. All 3 of us were also screaming and running for the door to help Belinda. When we made it out into the hall, we saw that the person was attempting to drag her to the elevator. Even though she was fighting as hard as she could, she was losing and getting closer to the elevator. Thankfully, my uncle came out of his room to see what was going on and saw Belinda being dragged away. He didn't hesitate to attack the person in the mask. Once he hit them a few times across the head, they dropped her and ran off down the hall. They made it to the stairwell and disappeared. We all ran to her to see if she was okay. She was obviously scared and upset, but thankfully didn't look to be hurt. Once he was sure she was all right, my uncle called hotel security and told them what had just happened, and they called the police. The four of us girls just sat there and held each other and cried. We were all so happy that Belinda was safe. Despite the hotel's attempt at catching the person by locking all the doors, the attacker still managed to get away. When the police arrived, we tried our best to describe the attacker, but since they were wearing all black and a mask, we didn't have much to go on. Belinda was pretty sure it was a man, but that was it. Over the rest of the week, we all spoke to the police several times and repeated what we had been doing the past couple of days. When my uncle heard about our little inside joke about being in town for a bachelor party and how we had been lying to the boys about our ages, he was mad, to say the least. The police told him that one of those boys was most likely the one that had grabbed Belinda. His theory was that they were trying to kidnap one of us to potentially sell us to a trafficker. Since we looked so much alike, it didn't matter which one of us opened the door. He said girls that looked like us were super popular in the rest of the world and that traffickers would pay top dollar for one of us. We were all so scared we spent the rest of the week in our room and refused to answer the door for anyone without a key. As soon as the police said it was okay for me to go home, I took the first flight back to Minnesota. I was still scared of strangers for a long time and had to go to counseling to get over the worst of it. From what my cousins told me later, they did also and found it hard to trust boys that they had just met. Unfortunately, the police were never able to find Belinda's attacker and punish him for what he had done. It had been a long time since this happened, and when we have taken family trips to Disneyland, I've caught myself wondering if one of the men walking around could be the one that tried to kidnap Belinda that night. Then I'd get a shiver down my spine and remember, it could have just as easily been me.
Excuse me for not being an amazing storyteller, but this is definitely a true story. My mother used to work at a hotel in Washington, D.C. It was back in the 90s, and she was a housekeeper, or maid. She needed money because she was a refugee from Vietnam. Even though she didn't know much English at the time, she knew enough to get by at her job. Plus, all the other hotel staff and guests loved her because of how sweet she was. Because of this, anytime high-profile guests, such as the Backstreet Boys, would come and stay at the hotel, the manager always sent my mum to clean their rooms. One day, a guest came. We'll refer to him as Mr. M. He checked into their most expensive suite. As usual, the manager told my mum to take care of this room. As she got there was a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, so she told the manager that she'd go back later. What was weird was that no one was ever allowed into Mr. M's room. The man stayed there for over a month, and not one time did he let any staff come in to clean. However, he paid a lot, and he always gave a warm welcome every time he passed a staff member or housekeeper, so no one paid him any attention really. Then, one day, people didn't see him anymore. They assumed he had checked out, even though the receptionist had no account of that. Since it had been so long since the room had been cleaned, the manager told my mum to go and check it out and try and clean up what she could. As she got to the room and unlocked the door, a disturbing smell hit her. She couldn't figure out what it was, but she continued to survey the room. It was disgustingly messy. In her words, it looked like someone had thrown a rave, despite the fact that no one else had ever gone into Mr. M's room. None of the other guests, at least. It looked like Mr. M had deserted the place without telling anyone. My mum was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track it down. As she followed the smell, she could tell it was coming from the closet. When she opened the closet, there was nothing but a cardboard box on the ground. The smell was clearly resonating from it. My mother's first instinct was to open the box to see what it was, and to clean and throw it out. What she found scarred her. It was the rotting, decomposing head of a young woman. My mother immediately screamed and got out of there. she fainted in the elevator. Once she woke up, the cops were everywhere, and the hotel was like a CSI scene. The manager told her that Mr. M wasn't the guy's real name, and he had used a fake credit card to check in. The head of the woman was identified to be that of a call girl. I don't know much more, or any of the nitty-gritty details, but I'm sure you can look it up on the internet for more information. Needless to say, my mum quit that day.